Good evening, anyone watching live now or listening later to the podcast version. It is my absolute pleasure to be joined tonight by horror agent extraordinaire, Mr. John Jarrold. John, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me.
No, like I said, we were talking about it before going live. I'm always surprised that people accept to be here because what's the interest for you when you get a random email out of the blue asking for a podcast conversation? Like,
Well,
what do you
it's
think?
interesting because I've been involved in publishing since 1988. The last thing I want to do now is what I was doing in 1988. Everything moves on, and it's great to hear new voices, great to hear new questions. It keeps me young, basically,
Mm.
doing that. I don't want to speak to all the same people I was speaking to in the late 80s or in the 70s when I started going to SF conventions. So
Right,
it's
right.
great to hear from people.
No, thank you. Really appreciate that. So, question for you, like the first one should be easy for you to answer. How did you become a literary agent? Like, that's not something anyone grows up wanting to become, I think.
No. Well, it goes back to going to conventions when I was a teenager. I started going to SF conventions when I was 19 years old. Met two of my heroes at my first convention, Brian Aldiss and James Blish. Got to know various publishers, agents, and authors over the years. Started doing book reports for an agent and for 5 different publishers. And in January 1988, I got my first job in publishing, which was basically running Orbit Books, which was an interesting start in publishing. And from then, for 15 years, I ran 3 SF imprints, fantasy imprints in London, Orbit, Random House, and then at Simon & Schuster. It got very corporate, and I got a bit fed up with sitting in meetings all day rather than doing my job. So I went freelance, and 2 years after that, authors started coming to me and saying, have you thought about being an agent? Would you be my agent? That's how it started. So there was no great plan involved in becoming an agent. And I started in the summer of 2004.
Wow, but you started running Orbit, like you couldn't start any higher, basically, could
No,
you?
it was amazing. My predecessor, Toby Roxburgh, had decided to go back to Scotland and start farming, which is what his family had done. And his boss, Richard Evans, was somebody I knew through conventions, as I did Toby. And he interviewed 6 people to basically become the Orbit publisher. The other 5 were already in publishing. I was working in public libraries, but I've been going to conventions for 15 years. And madly, he invited me to take the job. So it was an interesting learning curve.
And sorry to ask, but so how old were you at the time?
I was 34.
Okay, that's not necessarily something that would happen nowadays,
No,
is it?
it absolutely would not happen now. I left school at 16. That would not happen now because everybody I know in publishing went to university. I'd worked with books since 1972 when I started working in public libraries. But conventions, 73 onwards, reading for publishers. So I was relatively well known through conventions, and a lot of the authors I started publishing at Orbit already knew me through conventions, which was really useful. And I wasn't a sort of a 22-year-old straight out of university. I'd knocked around a bit. I knew what life was about, and I knew about books. It was learning about publishing. That was the thing when I started.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit because I worked in the city of London for a number of years, decades ago now, and I just got the tail end of that era where you could study whatever degree and just go straight into corporate finance in the city, or even, like you said, just leave school and join one of the investment banks.
Yeah,
I don't think that will happen anymore these days. Everyone
no.
needs to have a master's degree in economics or finance or whatever.
Exactly.
Like,
It's a very different world.
Yeah.
I was also lucky in that I was there when you would take an author for lunch and have maybe 2 or 3 bottles of wine on publication day with an author, come back to the office at 3:30, get on with work. Now, that's not going to happen now because everybody has mobile phones.
Yes.
And there are meetings all day long now. I mean, a lot of people I know in publishing will have a meeting from 10 to 12 and another one from 2:30 to 5. So I'm hugely delighted that they get a chance to actually do their job and sit at their desk.
So I'm going to be jumping from topic to topic here, so I do apologize. We were talking a little bit before going live. So you know Mr. Bilmes, Joshua Bilmes, the fantasy
Yeah.
agent, is based in New York. And when I asked him, he said he didn't care about the social media presence of an aspiring author.
Yeah.
Now, on Friday, I was interviewing horror writer Violet Castro, and she said that having a social media presence is really important. So I've got kind of conflicting views over the last year or so.
Okay.
What's
Well,
your take on that?
the basic thing is you don't take an author on because they're big on social media. You take an author on because you love the book. So that's about the voice. And
Right.
that's a subjective reaction that we all have to any creative art. We like it or we don't like it. So as a publisher or an agent, you have to love the author you take on, both personally and professionally. Social media doesn't come into that. If they have social media presence, then obviously it's something you mention to publishers when you submit the book. But it isn't one size fits all. It's about how it works for the author. Some love social media, some don't. Most people have a degree of social media presence, but it isn't necessary to have 1 million followers on Instagram, for instance.
Yeah. But I've seen, I don't know if it's a trend, but some people that, that corner of BookTube, people that are reviewing books, that writing, producing video essays about books, they build a substantial following, and then all of a sudden, hey, here's my book. So like,
Yeah,
oh, it's like, was that the ultimate end game? Were you just trying to support or build a base for your writing career, or did it just happen because I don't know?
yeah. I mean, that again will depend on the individual person. Some start off on something like Book Talk and start as a reviewer and then think about writing a book. Some absolutely use that as a way in with writing as the long-term plan. So again, it's not one size fits all.
Yeah. I hear you. I wanted to go somewhere else with this, but we'll come back on. Yeah. Can it be a double-edged sword? Like, would you like look at someone's postings on social media, because you were talking about getting on with the person, because you're
Yeah,
dealing with the person.
yeah.
So would you run some sort of quote unquote background check on the social media presence?
Well, it's not so much a background check. Obviously, don't be an idiot and don't be arrogant.
How many
Are two.
people fail that test, right?
Oh, really? You know, there. I see stuff on Facebook and on Blue Sky every day, and I just think, don't say that. You know, it's not funny. I suspect you think it's funny. It isn't funny. And being arrogant is never a good thing, because you're not in a competition with other authors. It's a community of authors. We should all be supportive, and it's very difficult when you do see that. So yeah, I mean, there are authors and this goes back to publishing before the internet. There are authors who have a reputation, and you think, I might not take them on because they sound as if they're going to be difficult, and it's really difficult to get the book trade to take an author seriously. If the author is known to be difficult, that adds another layer to it. So in commercial terms, you think about that.
Yeah, I tell my students that I'm a teacher by trade, and I always tell them, like, is what you're about to say or do gonna make you look like an idiot? And if the answer is yes, don't do it. But they still failed that simple test.
Yeah, well, some will always fail it because they can't. Some people will never think they're doing anything wrong.
Yeah. So my next point, and you sort of briefly touched on it, you say it is a community of writers, you're sort of supporting each other. But I had a look at, I mean, I'm sure I mentioned before, Flame Tree Press, right? I
Yes.
went to their website. The amount of authors that they've got there, just this one publisher in the
Yeah.
UK, is it a saturated market?
In terms of horror, it has been saturated in the past. I mean, when I started with Orbit in '88, it had already got to the state of being saturated that some publishers had, this month's horror book or this month's 2 horror books. And that led to a real downturn in horror outside of a few big names, and we all know who they are.
Which didn't write horror, by the way.
Yeah. And some of them, the publishers now, are looking more for horror than they were. But again, you're looking for an author. I think the major changes is that in the 70s and 80s, a lot of publishers in the US and sometimes in the UK had this month's dragon fantasy, or this month's military science fiction novel, or this month's horror novel. And now you're much more looking at an individual author to publish rather than a book in a subgenre.
Right. Okay. Because horror's got many subgenres, and you've got something like, and hopefully we'll get to talk about something like Ramsey Campbell. But then I read there's a book I didn't finish. It was this sort of splatter gore. And I like, to me, that's not horror. It's just like a torture porn thing. Is that something you deal with? Has something like that got any merit?
I'm sure somebody else might think it has merit. I don't. I was never interested in sort of the gore side of horror. If there's a great story in there and there is some gore in it, then sometimes it will work. But I'm certainly not thinking, oh, I really want a book with lots of blood. I like something a little bit more subtle, a bit more sophisticated than that. I mean, I've known Ramsey since the 1970s through conventions, long before I was in publishing, and I'm deeply proud to be his agent. And you mentioned Flame Tree. I mean, they published the Incubations last year, which was the 60th anniversary of his first writing horror fiction, and I couldn't be happier to be involved with him. And again, there is a sense of uneasiness in almost everything he writes from the first page. And it's not that that's horror to begin with, but it leads to horror. And a lot of people will say, oh, you must start a book with action. Well, no, not in terms of having somebody's head cut off, not in terms of having a huge battle, if it's fantasy, not in terms of having a big starship, if it's science fiction. It's the voice. And I've known books where there's a teenage girl being made up in front of a mirror before she goes on at a circus, a guy walking through a forest, obviously to a meeting that he doesn't want to do. Ramsey, you will find there's just a sense of uneasiness. So it's that gets you, that hooks you. And again, it's the voice. And because we all have that subjective reaction to each individual book, sometimes I will see something and think, this is very good, but it isn't making me go, wow. Therefore, I'm not the right agent. And I'll tell the author that and say that if they like, I can suggest some other agents they could go to. They may know them already. Because, again, it isn't one size fits all. I took on as a publisher a lot of authors whose taste I admired had turned down. And they did the same with authors I turned down. So just because as an author you're turned down by one agent, it doesn't mean the end of the thing. That's the beginning of it.
Yeah. There's so many stories of, so many rejections, isn't it? And until they find success.
It took Ian Banks 6 books before he got his first deal. And Ian Banks is the best author I ever worked with.
Okay. Oh, you've worked with Mr. Banks.
Yeah, I published Ian. Again, we knew each other through conventions before I got into publishing. And he was being published in paperback by Orbit then, in hardback by Macmillan. And I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time to take him on for Orbit in hardback with the use of weapons in 1990.
But I'm assuming that's the beauty of working in the UK. It's not that big a country, isn't it? If you have to go, if you live in London and you have to go to a convention in Birmingham, Manchester, whatever, it's not that far to travel. It's not the US.
This year's Easter SF convention, the National British SF convention, is in Belfast. I've never been to Belfast, so I'm looking forward to that. The World SF convention was in Glasgow last year, and that's my third Glasgow WorldCon after 1995 and 2005. And it's a community worldwide, and obviously the internet's helped with that, in that we get in touch much more easily than we did before email. But whether I'm dealing with authors in Australia, in India, in the US, in the UK, there is that sense of immediacy now that there wasn't 25, 30 years ago, when you had to send a fax and get a fax back.
Okay. So, something I discussed with Ms. Castro on Friday, which I'm starting to change my mind thanks to Mr. Campbell, but I've always held the view that the natural habitat of horror is the short story format, because I think you have to maintain that tension and that suspense and give the reader that spook that is far easier to do over 10, 20 pages than it is over 700 pages. And I'm not naming a very big American writer, which I don't think that's horror. But then maybe you can get away in 250 pages.
Yes.
What's your take on that? Is the short story format the natural habitat of horror?
Well, people have said that about horror and about science fiction. And again, I would say it depends on the author. I've known some very good horror novelists and science fiction novelists who don't feel happy writing short fiction, but also some who started writing short fiction and then moved to writing novels. It's a happy situation now that a 250-page book, 100,000 words, is much more acceptable commercially than it was 10 years ago. You were looking for big fat books all the time. And now, for various reasons, a lot of publishers are saying 80 to 100, 120 is their sweet spot for books. And I think it's easier to maintain that sense of growing horror over that length than over 250,000 words.
Yeah. So, in your ample experience, an aspiring horror writer, is there some kind of path that they should? Are there any stages, like you should start with short stories and then build your way up, or again, different people will start at different places?
Exactly right. And I've known people on both sides of that street. People who have started as a short story writer and people who started as novelists. So you shouldn't be prescriptive about these things. It's going to be what works for the author rather than, again, trying to fit them into a box. That's never a good thing.
And what about, because I think Mr. Campbell's story to me is fascinating, like his first publication done by August Derleth, The Inhabitant of the Lake, was just a sort of copy, homage, or pastiche of Lovecraftian stories set in this valley on Merseyside. Is there a value on starting off trying to sound or doing your take on some other authors and then possibly developing from there?
It was a different time when Ramsay started doing that. And with August Derleth, it wasn't a big press. So you're not likely to get a deal with one of the major publishers on either side of the Atlantic if you do that now. But it is certainly something you can look at in terms of writing for a small press. And some will be interested, some won't. And there's just been an anthology published of stories based around the ideas in Robert Holdstock's Mythago Wood. And all the authors in that treat it very differently. Some are actually relating it to Mythago Wood and those books. Some are just using that idea and then building on that. So you can still do that, but it's much less done now probably than it was 50 years ago.
Yeah, I can see that. But then for someone wanted to get into these anthologies, do they have to be at the stage where they have an agent, where the agent can go, hey, look, so-and-so is putting an anthology around this or that or the other, why don't you chip in with a story?
Not always, because again, this is the good side of the internet. Quite often you will see an anthology mentioned, I am looking for stories about X. And at that point, you can get in touch with the editor or the publisher directly. So with short fiction, it's much less necessary to have an agent if you want to go that route. A lot of mainstream publishers now won't accept submissions from unagented authors. They basically use us as a cutout. And if it's come from a reputable agent, at least they know it's worth looking at.
Yeah. Okay. So then my next question would be about writing for an established IP. Like, does that allow you to judge the underlying talent of an author? Say back in the 80s, when Dungeons and Dragons was a big thing, a lot of writers were writing under the Dungeons and Dragons umbrella, novels for the RPG. You name it, Star Wars, some big established IP. Can an author start writing within that mold and then break away from it? Will that enable you or are the novels written just to pay the bills?
Well, in terms of an established IP these days, the person who is publishing that IP will quite often know authors they want to get involved with. Sometimes you can go to them with an author as an agent and say, this author knows the IP really well, loves it, would love to write for it, as Tim Napper did with Alien last year. But it is much more business-led, because the publisher then has to go to the owner of the IP and talk about it. So quite often they will come to the author with an idea rather than it being entirely the author's idea.
I see. Okay. Stupid question before we move on to something a bit more serious. Can vampires be sexy? Is that allowed in horror?
Yeah. I don't put parameters on things. Vampires do not have to be sexy. Vampires can be sexy. Some sexy vampires will be interesting to me and some won't. So again, it's about the individual book.
Yeah. They shouldn't be. Anyway, we know they shouldn't be, but it's okay. I think something like True Blood or Interview with a Vampire have done the genre a disservice, but that's my opinion. I'm not putting words in your mouth.
Entirely. I mean, vampires themselves are a broad subgenre, so there are many worlds within that subgenre.
Yeah. Some are definitely not worth exploring. But anyway, back to the whole short story versus the novel. I got introduced into horror with the works of H.P. Lovecraft, and I sort of dream of what it would have been like to go to your newsagents and grab, weird tales or spooky tales or whatever it was. So I think there are some real gems in those 30s, 40s pulp magazines, but they felt almost like disposable. It's a quick consumption, read in 10, 15 minutes. And is that then doing a disservice to the writer and the creator?
Well, again, it's a different world. My dad used to read pulp magazines in the 20s and 30s and 40s. I grew up reading M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Machen, and H.P. Lovecraft. But I was reading the Lovecraft collections being published in paperback. This is about 1967, 68. So it is a very different world than it was then in terms of magazines. A lot of magazines are online now rather than printed. And the pulp magazines were used as ballast in ships. A lot of the magazines my dad read had come over from the States as ballast in ships and were then thrown out into a newsagent's. No, you don't get that anymore. So it is a very different world.
It was a much more romantic world, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a much more business-led world now than it was.
Yeah. It's a bit of a shame, isn't it? I think
everything changes. I mean, it's different than it was when I started in '88 in publishing. So you have to admit that things will change. Obviously, publishing itself is more corporate than it was in 1988. The conglomerates are gradually buying up each other. So there are fewer publishers. In the UK, you can still send a book to Penguin, to Random House, or to Transworld, Bantam and Corgi. In the US, quite often, for instance, Bantam and Del Rey are now all part of one place. So you can only send it to one editor there. And if they turn it down, you can't send it to anybody else at Bantam or Del Rey.
No, okay. It's a sorry state of affairs. Because, I mean, I've got a secondary channel in Spanish, and I was talking to a comics editor here, and he was talking about we need, reading is a hobby or a pastime or whatever you want to call it in the wane. It seems to be. I'm a teacher. I can see almost none of our kids read. When I was a kid, it wasn't uncommon to go to a friend's house and spend the afternoon trading comics, your Mickey Mouse magazine or whatever, your Asterix, your European comics. And he was telling me, this editor, that we need to create new readers. But how can we create new readers when these children's comics magazines are disappearing? When I don't think we are, or editors, agents, publishers are offering new material to kids, or am I wrong here?
I think it varies. I mean, I don't deal with children's publishers because it's a very different area, but I speak to them, some of whom I've known going back for 30 years or more. Now, they are far more cut and dried in terms of what age group a book is intended for. They will say it's for 8 to 10s, 11 to 13s, 14 to 16. And the book has to be right for that age group before they will take it seriously. I've seen several things recently about boys not reading very much, but then I've seen that going back decades.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think we can talk about computer games, which is one of those things that people do talk about, taking the place of comics and reading. Now, it will lead some people onto reading, and it will read, but not everybody. I think the world is different, and also you have to be aware as a publisher or an agent what the book trade will take, because if it's pointless trying to publish something if you know that your main buyers won't take that area. So conversations between the book selling trade and publishers need to be, I think, much stronger in terms of new ideas. Publishing is much more sales and marketing led than it was 30 years ago. Most salespeople I know like looking at what worked last year because that worked, therefore it's safe, therefore let's do it again. I think editors tend to be looking more at new things as well as good versions of an old idea. So you have to be aware of that. And having been a publisher before I became an agent, I'm aware of what's changed, but also what stayed the same. I would love to see, although I don't deal with children's books, I would love to see more books pushing children into reading. No, that's not unfair, not pushing, but helping children read. So again, it's not an easy problem.
Because I mean, I grew up in Spain before. I lived in the UK for over 20 years. But when I was a kid, every Sunday paper in Spain, whether it was a left wing, right wing, middle wing, north wing, whatever, had the children's magazine, and it would be a collection of short comic books or stories or whatever. And every Sunday, my grandmother would buy all the papers, even though she would only read one particular one, because then us grandchildren will get all the different funny papers. Now that got lost. That in the 90s that disappeared. So the kids are not getting anymore the Sunday fix of comics. Is that something you've seen also reflected in the UK as well?
Well, yeah, because when I was a child, one of my cousins worked for W.H. Smith's, which was the biggest newspaper and bookseller. And so he got comics very cheaply. So every Thursday morning, I got 7 comics. And I loved that. Some of them were cartoons. Some of them were printed words. And I adored them. So Thursday evening, I would read them all. I don't see that anymore. And in the same way that a lot of news agents who 30, 40, 50 years ago had a spin rack of paper bags, you don't see that anymore. So that's one of the things that's changed, and it's where you go to replace it, because you can't base things entirely on supermarkets, which publishers love, of course, because if they can do a deal for 30,000 books in a supermarket, they go few. Whereas you're looking to get as wide a readership as you possibly can, and that's not easy when Smiths now, unless you're a long-term bestseller, or unless the publisher is putting a huge amount into the marketing spend, aren't really interested in new authors. Waterstones, which is the other major group in the UK for selling books, have changed all the parameters of their book buying. So whereas you might have seen 6 copies of a book by an author on publication day, you'll see 1 now. And then they think, oh, we've sold that, that's good, we can look at next month's books. So I don't think you get the long-term thinking that once you did get.
But has this change responded to trend changes, or has it responded more to a business?
It's a business model.
It's a business model.
Yeah. So if they put all their money behind long-term bestsellers, they're taking less risk. Now, I think publishing is about taking risk. That's where new authors come from. Everybody had the first book published at some point. Everybody believed in that book at some point. So, whether you're looking at Ian Banks, as I say, or whether you're looking at Ramsey, or a lot of different authors. When I went to Orbit, Christopher Fowler joined us from Random House quite soon after that. So his horror novels. I think it's really thinking again outside the box and thinking, how can we build this author? At that point, I assumed I had 4 books to build an author. Now, with all the changes about book buying that the book trade are doing, if the first book doesn't work, they may not take the second book at all. So that's a major change. And you have to, so that's why a lot of publishers now are even more careful than I was about taking on a new author, because if they don't think that book is going to sell a reasonable number of books, they might not take the author on.
They want to.
It's no good saying, oh, in 4 books' time they'll be great. This book has to be great.
I get that. So, and obviously, I understand and appreciate if you cannot give me a straightforward answer there. So, if you're selling a first book to a publisher, like Mr. Bilmes told me, he's selling some books, fantasy books in the US, and maybe he's selling them for 3-4 grand, maybe 10, 12 grand, but that's not going to take anyone off the day job. So
the one thing I've said to every author is, don't give up the day job. You're not 99.999% of published authors are never going to make a living from writing. It isn't that. It's about doing it because you love it, and it's on top of what you do for a living. I know authors who write for 2 hours before they start work, write for 2 hours after they finish work, only write at weekends. But really believing that writing will be your career in terms of making money is a pipe dream. It's not going to happen to almost anybody.
And
I was saying that in 1988 as well as now.
Yeah. So basically, when I went to Flame Tree Press and I went to their website and look at the host of authors that they got there, with the exception perhaps of Mr. Campbell, everyone's got a day job.
Yeah, I would guess that the majority, certainly. Certainly, you're looking at £5,000 not being an unusual advance now. Obviously, if you're dealing with a mainstream publisher who wants to buy world rights, you'll get a bigger advance because they can sell it throughout the world in all translation markets. Mm-hmm. But if you're selling UK, US rights, then yes, what Joshua says, entirely agree with.
Okay, all right. Oh, it's certainly well, I guess it's a low risk, high reward endeavor, isn't it?
Yeah, I think because the book trade are being so much more careful, publishers are also being far more careful. Books I might have bought for £20,000 in 1992 might now go for £8,000 plus an additional royalty if that earns out within 12 months. So you're looking at different possibilities with contractual levels of royalties and additional sums based on how many copies it sells in the first year, say. So you try and be creative about all these things.
Yeah. Well, so next question then, and this is tying up to your next meeting that we're not going to talk about, but I'm curious about the managing of international rights, because I was interviewing a couple of months ago, if you know the name, Christopher Rocchio. At the moment, it's a big fantasy, right? So his publisher in the US, I think they've got like a branch here in Spain, but they wouldn't publish and translate his books into Spanish. It's being a different publisher that has acquired the rights of his series to translate and publish here in Spain. So how does the whole dealing and negotiating of international rights work, and how is it possible that a multinational may decide to not actually sell their own author in different countries?
Well, it isn't that they don't decide to, it's that the subgroup in that country decide not to take on that author, which again goes back to that subjectivity that I discussed, whereas another publisher did see it and took it on. And again, this depends on whether you're selling world rights, in which case the publisher will be talking to people across the world, or you're only selling English rights, in which case you as an agent will have your sub-agents across the world, and you'll discuss with each of them what you're doing with an individual author. And you might find out that one of them in one area, in one territory, that author is writing exactly what that territory wants, whereas another territory, they don't want that area of SF fantasy or horror. So again, it's still about horses for courses. It's still about what works for each individual country, whether it's anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the Far East, anywhere in South America, anywhere in Africa. Some will say yes to this and some will say no to this. And again, it's every time you look at it, you do it separately. You do not assume that this will work everywhere, anything.
I just find that curious, right, from my point of view, that if you got your book being published by a big multinational, that in a particular country where you've got the US as your reference and it's selling well over there, that they wouldn't take the punt and translate it into German, French, Italian, whatever it may be.
When I worked for Random House, I remember speaking to various European sub-areas of Random House, and somebody that was selling really well said, yeah, that doesn't sell in our area at all.
And there are those clearly marked differences in markets.
Yeah. I'm talking about everything I do. In some areas, I know I'm not going to sell science fiction. In some areas, I know I'm not going to sell big fantasy. And the reverse may be true in those two areas, that the big fantasy works in the one that doesn't like science fiction, or vice versa.
It's interesting. I mean, I know, for instance, I don't know, but maybe it's a genre that works everywhere. But possibly here in Spain, we don't have barely any fantasy writers, but we are big on historical fiction.
Yeah.
For whatever the reason, but I don't think we've ever produced a half decent fantasy writer.
And it's interesting because that also relates to something that a lot of publishers are talking about, and we've been talking about 3-4 years, which is the crossover market. So between historical fiction and some fantasy, there is definitely a crossover market. I think of an author like Guy Gavriel Kay, who basically will write in an analog of a given historical period, but with a fantasy edge. Now, most people who like good historical fiction will like Guy's novels. And you're seeing mysteries in a fantasy world or a science fiction world now. So again, that gives the publisher a possibility of selling it outside just the genre readers. And that's something in the last 3-4 years that a lot of people have been talking about.
Because like we've got here in Spain, there's a massive selling author, Santiago Posteguillo. He sold millions of Roman historical fiction written about, Caesar and Hadrian, the emperor, and stuff like that. And it's like, but he's not translated into English. And it's like, to me, like, again, you got a guy clearly with a clear track record of selling millions. And the rights are not being bought outside of Spanish-speaking countries. I find that weird. Again,
it's interesting because when I was at Simon & Schuster, we published Christian Jacques, the French author of Ancient Egypt, and did very well with him. And again, it'll be an individual thing that you'll, as a British publisher or a US publisher, you'll need to see a translation before you consider taking an author on. But as you know, there are so many non-Anglo authors who are not published outside their local area or their local areas, who should be. And I find it very frustrating to talk to publishers, and I did as a publisher, that you want to see this going across the world, not just in one specific area.
Yeah. Is it sometimes that maybe the flavor is too local and the publishers may think that it won't translate well?
In some cases, yes. But in some cases, I think, again, it's seeing that translation. Until you see the translation, you won't take it seriously, no matter how many copies it's sold, because you've got to believe it will sell in your language, in the English language. After that, yes. And that's exactly what happened with Christian and Jacques. And that's what's happened with a number of authors. And I think, we can all name the European authors and the non-Anglo authors who have been published and have been successful. Umberto Eco is an obvious choice.
Yeah.
But you needed to see that in English before that deal was done.
And would that be up to the author to finance that translation? It depends on a publisher taking a punt?
It will depend on what rights the author has sold. If they have only sold, for example, Spanish language rights to the publisher, then yes, it may be that a UK or US publisher will be interested if they see, for instance, the first 6 chapters translated and then a full synopsis. If the author has sold more than Spanish rights to the Spanish publisher, then it will be between the publisher and the author to work out how that happens. And to get the right translator, that's so important, that it isn't about transliteration. It's a proper translation that works in the English language.
Because that's kind of similar to what happened to, and I'm going to butcher the name here, the writer of Hex, Thomas All.
Yeah.
He actually basically rewrote the book. He changed the setting in order to be able to sell internationally, isn't it?
That's right.
That's just going one step or 10 steps beyond just a mere translation of the work.
Absolutely. And I know Thomas, and it's about that individual author deciding to do that and being very proactive about that. So in some cases, I think maybe an author will, as you say, sell very well in their home territory or their home language, and then sit back and wait for other stuff to happen. And maybe some of them, not all, but some of them could be more proactive about how that might work in the English language markets or other language markets.
Yeah. I am mindful of time, and I'm really grateful. You're a fountain of wisdom. If I could ever borrow you again, I'm really enjoying this. The problem with these things, sometimes when I have an episode like this, I need to go to bed because I work tomorrow, but I can't because I'm buzzing after having such a great conversation.
I know. So. Well, thank you very much. It's fun. As I say, I love doing this.
I've got one final question for you, because if I could just nick 5-10 more minutes of your time.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of fashionable that I've seen many authors fall into the horror genre through H.P. Lovecraft. I'm guilty of that. I'm not right, but I perpetrated some short stories. Anyway, different story. Someone like Neil Gaiman, someone like Mr. Ramsey Campbell.
Yeah.
And then years later, Stephen King, and then years later, they become very derogatory of H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah.
I've seen that happen. Why is that the case? Because I think he created something so special and so unique, and he gave so much and influenced so much the genre. Why this trend of going back against it, or belittling or putting down the works?
I think it's that the situation with H.P. Lovecraft in reality, as opposed to H.P. Lovecraft, the writer. And also some of that will feed across in that you can see the racism in some of the stories. And you can see that basically if you read about his life, that he probably should never have left Providence, because the time he spent in New York, he hated.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the sense of cosmic horror, the sense of the elder gods, is wonderful. Quite possibly without his mental attitudes to various matters, that would not have come through as strongly as it has. And I was watching something on YouTube last night about H.P. Lovecraft movies, and some of them going back to the 60s, some of them for the last 5 years. And the way that will be dealt with, of course, would be different over that period of time. But to answer your question, it's really because things change, and much more is known about an author now than was known about H.P. Lovecraft at the time those stories were published. And that feeds into what people will think of an author. Some will separate the art from the artist. Some won't be able to do that.
Yeah, which unfortunately, and I don't want to go into it, but it's something that is very much a topic these days with Neil Gaiman.
Yeah.
And I don't want to go there.
No.
But then the question I can ask you is, does it mean that, because I was talking to my wife about it this morning, does it mean that whatever piece of art, literature, movies, pictorial, whatever, music, doesn't mean that we have to run a background check on every artist to decide whether we can actually enjoy their art or not? That seems like a very ineffective way to go about life.
I mean, if you're looking at historical artists, whether it's writers, painters, filmmakers, whatever, it's a different thing from looking at somebody in the present day. And I won't say any more than that. But nonetheless, some people will absolutely be able to separate the art from the artist. Some will not, and that's down to the individual person.
No, I totally get that, and like I said, I don't really want to talk about it because it's a complicated issue and so on. Mr. Jarrold, this has been absolutely fantastic. I'm exceptionally grateful that you were here tonight.
A real pleasure and great enjoyment for me as well. So thank you so much.
No, really appreciate that. Hopefully you have a few minutes time between now and your next much more important meeting than
5
this.
minutes.
Fantastic.
I shall have a cup of tea and then another conversation. But thank you so much for asking me, Jose. It's much appreciated.
No, thank you. I may have to get in touch and do it some other time.
Of course.
I hope everything goes well. Thank you very much, and take lots of care.
And take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.